You're tuned to the wavelength of your own beauty. It's your host, Ahmed Yunus, and this is The Steps. Okay, we're recording.
Okay.
Dr. Brian João Garcia, son of Artesia, son of Portugal, scholar of early post-revolutionary American fiction, and how it comes to inform, define, educate what America is. The dissertation was called Everything Was Strange. And every time I think about your dissertation, I think about that Doors song, When You're a Stranger Face. I love that song. Okay.
When you're strange.
Oh, man, dude. Okay, let's not talk about the days when we used to listen to the Doors for too long. Okay, good. And started his academic career Long Beach City College, is now an academic at Long Beach City College. Dr. Garcia, Brian, my brother, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I feel like I'm unqualified to be here.
Get out of here, dog. You're about to prove that wrong right now. Okay. What I'm hoping to do, man, is I want to bifurcate it into two sections. One is like you, the family, the identity, the community, America, Portugal, that. Mm-hmm. But first, I would be so blessed if you could just walk us through post-revolutionary America. Who's writing? What are they kind of writing about? What's the flavor? What's the vibe? And then how does it inform the complete disaster that is, the modern American moment?
Well, there's a lot to chew on there. How it all relates to my research, which I'm returning to for this conversation. It's Long Beach City College does not call on my but yeah, basically what it comes down to is that the United States in the late 18th century, post-revolutionary, or what I refer to in my dissertation as early national America, is in this unique situation where it's really trying to figure out what it is. And there are all basically, it's not just politically that this is happening. The revolution has happened, and there are all these weird questions that are taking place, which, I know that you're familiar with through, studying the Constitution and all that. There are debates about, like, what is a president? And all these weird ways that symbols kind of come into that. So, when Americans are trying to figure out what the hell even a president is, some people are worried that the president is going to just become a king. And then people go, wait a minute, and the president is George and he was a British military officer? We can't have this. He's just another king. Like, there are all these crazy conversations like that. And because I studied English and American literature, my sort of entry point to that was to look at the literature of the time. And in the same way that the political discourse is this attempt to figure out what America is going to be politically, the literature is trying to establish a literary and artistic cultural identity that is separate from Europe. And so much of the discourse that you see taking place in politics that is trying to say, well, we're no longer England, and also we're not France, and then there are these weird splits where some people are Francophiles and some people are Anglophiles, and that's also happening in literature, and it's happening both separate from the political struggle and as part of the political struggle. So, for example,
when you say literature, you mean like stories and poems?
Poems, fiction, And it's interestingly enough, there's a lot of actual overlap in that a lot of the people who had the leisure time to be it, because there wasn't like a class of there wasn't like a class of writers yet. There weren't professional writers until like the 1820s. A lot of the people who are the first writers are also the first ambassadors. Like Joel Barlow was a diplomat. Royal Tyler was a diplomat. Washington Irving was a diplomat. I mean, if you go to the Alhambra in Spain, there's still a room with Washington. It was Washington Irving's office. You know, he was. Yeah.
Whoa.
He was the ambassador.
Hambra, there is a Washington Irving office?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, it's still got his name above the door. Like, that's crazy, and so you had all these writers who were simultaneously, they were doing several things at once. One is they're just trying to be writers. These are people who love the arts, they love literature. They want to be writers, but there is not an infrastructure for book selling and publishing in the United States quite yet. The other is that they're trying to establish an American literature that's separate from England, because there's this kind of cultural inferiority complex. Everything that we're doing up to this point is imitating European artifacts, and we've got to kind of make our own literature. What's it going to look like?
Who's our Shakespeare? Who's our...
Exactly. And there are all these kind of literary beefs that take place between regions within the United States, but also like
regional nationalisms. You call that regional nationalisms in the
regional nationalisms, exactly. Like there's this kind of cultural fight between New England and New York and the South, and all of that is kind of
triangulated. Like 90s hip hop.
It actually really is a lot like it. Yeah, I mean, where people had they would make their careers by getting into fights, you know, these literary fights, and they would write in. They would use pen names and insult each other back and forth, and they would have whole magazines just dedicated to insulting their rivals, and some of it was really funny stuff, and some of it is pretty jingoistic crap, but it's kind of all happening while the country is kind of trying to figure itself out. And so a lot of what ends up happening is that these authors who are kind of struggling to both strike out on their own with a unique artistic voice are also trying to go, okay, what the hell is America? And there were a lot of really explicitly patriotic, really jingoistic, in my opinion, really, really bad books and poems. Like Joel Barlow wrote this epic that was supposed to be like the American Aeneid, and it's really goofy kind of. And part of the problem is that he's imitating European forms. Philip Freneau was another one, but then what happens is you get a few people who there are a few different strains, but basically on one hand you have writers who are writing what at the time is not necessarily respected as literature. It's like romantic novels, but within the American context they're actually doing something interesting, and they're selling books as opposed to the guys who are just trying to write like America is great poems. And then, and this is what my dissertation focused on, you have figures like Royal Tyler and Washington Irving and Charles Brockden Brown and some others who are approaching it ironically. And these are the guys who are writing books and stories and poems that are partaking of that kind of struggle to figure out what America is politically and artistically, but they're extremely conscious of the struggle, and they're kind of poking fun at it. So when you read Washington Irving, one of the things that I argue in my dissertation is that like there's this tendency for us now 200 years later to look back on his writing and go, oh, look, he was struggling to figure out what America was, and I'm picking that out of his text. And part of what I argue is like, no, you're not picking that out of his text. He did that he knows what he's doing. And if you read his earlier works, you can see that he's setting up this kind of decades-long joke about American identity.
Wow.
And so there's this kind of ironic detachment from the struggle that the identitarian struggle that they are enacting in their own work. Now, how does that relate to now? Well, the way that I look at national identity is as a series of stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And that's not necessarily like a super groundbreaking observation. That is kind of what tradition is, identity is. But part of what I am kind of constantly struggling with as far as using this framework to look at where we are now or how we got here or how we think of ourselves in this country is to think of the ways in which, for example, our relationship to certain values or certain foundational documents is constructed separate from the actual content of those documents. So let me give you an example. For those of us who have read the Bible, for example, or who have read the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, these texts that people constantly cite, but clearly they haven't read those texts. For those of us who have studied those texts, that's a really frustrating conversation to have. You know this as well as I do, right? It's a really frustrating argument because you have people constantly referring to the Constitution, constantly referring to the Declaration of Independence, constantly referring to a history they clearly don't know. And one of the easiest ways to dismiss that, and it's rhetorically effective to win an argument, and I do it all the time, is to just call it out as hypocrisy, right? To go, no, that's not even in the book. Look, let me show you right here. You got it wrong, right? The post office comes before the Second Amendment in the Constitution. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But part of the understanding of how this works in like the minds of nationalists, let's say, and I don't mean that like pejorative. I just mean like people who
nationalisms in the paradigm of the nationalisms. Yeah,
exactly. The part of the way that it works is that the kind of tropes that are operating in our minds when we're doing that are not necessarily the tropes that are in the content of the document, but the document itself becomes a trope. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It doesn't actually matter that someone hasn't read the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence itself is the symbol that they're kind of running with. And it means something completely different than actually going through and reading the content of the Declaration. Does that make sense?
Of course, yeah. Like we are elevating the subjective interpretation over like a baseline objective understanding of at least prima facie what the language says, if not like the intention of the writers, if not any of that stuff.
Exactly. And so, and this is where, you know, when I read your recent essay, like when you mentioned alterity being elevated to an end unto itself, this is kind of that triggered a kind of memory of something that I wrote in my dissertation, which is actually the chapter where I quote you.
Oh man!
Yeah, the Shaikh McScrooge chapter.
Shaikh McScrooge khutbah. I remember that, dog. That was so fun. I got in a lot of trouble for that one. Yeah,
it was a really interesting look at how symbols kind of work in national discourse. It's like part of the whole reason that I used your sermon in that chapter was because it was really interesting how your use of this DuckTales reference was a way of kind of bridging these religious and ethnic and national discourses pretty effortlessly. Like it's just this little joke. It could be just this kind of throwaway line, but it does a lot of work. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to watch an episode of DuckTales or the Disney Christmas Carol. Like it just the joke just kind of works because you have this community that is like steeped in all of that. And part of what I was saying in that chapter was essentially that a nation as such, as a sort of whatever, there are various definitions of what a nation is, but they all kind of come down to this unifying sort of concept that puts all people within certain categories into this one group that is philosophically kind of weak, but politically extremely strong. And basically what I was kind of trying to tease out was, is the nation something that serves the people that live in it? Or like the concept of the nation, is it something that serves humanity? Or is it something that humanity has elevated to the end itself so that now we are serving it? And if so, then what is the point? You see what I mean? Like, what is your loyalty to the nation? Is it to your fellow citizens, or is it just to this concept? What are you fighting for? And then this is one of the things that Benedict Anderson's book, Imagine Communities, kind of struggles with, is like, you can call the nation weak, you can call the nation fake, but it's not fake. People die for this. It's fake in the sort of empirical sense, but it's not fake.
It's not fake. And you know, it's amazing. It's amazing, B, because when you talk to people, like, you know, obviously, like, we're going to go into this idea of us being the children of immigrants growing up in Southern California. When I talk to Egyptians who are pro-Egyptian, if you will, like military dictatorship, classical Egyptian governance structure, they, you know, you'll say like, okay, but like we, you know, this is happening here and we dealt with it this way. Why would we not deal with it this way when it's happening here? Wait, hold on. The gardener is fucking me over. Hold on. So, you know, the conversation will be like, no, this is Egypt. Egypt is something different than what you're talking about and what they're talking about. Yeah, right. Like, you're right. Like we raise the symbol to overwhelm the supposed originating meaning of what that symbol means. What's fascinating about your take on nationalisms is, in many ways, like what a Texan pro-Trump Republican narrates as the story of what it means to be American is very different than what we narrate to ourselves as what it means to be American. And surely one is not more authentic or inauthentic than the other. So then the question like arises, how do we bridge that gap in a way that is meaningful for the future of the country, right? Like right now, Donald Trump is using every tool he's got, even this leaf blower that's screwing my segment, every tool he's got to attempt to shove down people, like today's tweet, you know, hey, if you live in the suburbs, watch out.
Yeah.
Suburbs, you know, I'm either going to keep it safe for you or it's going to be, which is obviously like racial dog whistles, etc. How do we bridge the narratives? How do we bridge the nationalisms, or how do we dialogue between them?
Honestly, I don't know. I have a really hard time with it, but my sort of academic training and outlook is a critical one. It's to sort of point to the problematic aspects and go like, look, this has origins in stuff that happened a few hundred years ago, and it's really interesting how it manifests. And here are some interesting ways that we can play with it. But the more it manifests in its current state, to be quite honest, I I'm much more pessimistic now than I think I once was.
Hmm.
You know, and I wouldn't say that I ever was terribly optimistic, but it's like Cornel West. I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful, right?
You're starting to lose some of that hopefulness.
Yeah, it's hard, you know, and the example you used of Texas is really interesting because I used to teach a literature class that was based pretty heavily on my research, and so I would have my students as a sort of primer read, you know, theorizations of nationalism, so they had the sort of foundational definitions so that we could discuss the texts. And one of the ways that I would explain this to them, you know, just conversationally, was to ask them, why do you, living in Irvine, at the time I was in Irvine, why do you living in Irvine have more in common with somebody in New Hampshire than you do with somebody in Tijuana? Like, do you actually, or is it just that the lines on the map say you do, right? And to a large extent, they don't, you know, particularly because so many of them are actually Mexican American. But you also can't discount the fact that California and New Hampshire are part of the same political system, largely same culture in terms of popular culture and all of that. And honestly partake of a lot of the same mythologies. And so when you talk about like what a Texan would consider authentically American versus what a Californian would consider authentically American, it's really interesting because there is a kind of cosmopolitanism that I think, and look, of course, we're talking in generalities. There are plenty of conservative Californians, and there are plenty of, you know, but in those generalities, like there is a cosmopolitanism that California takes pride in that, you know, maybe not every region does. But even so, we still grew up with like the Stater Brothers Heartland commercial. Yes, you know, like that Heartland means something, and that's
Aunt Jemima. We grew up with Aunt Jemima,
right?
Stuff.
Yeah,
we grew up with all that.
But that is an appeal to authenticity. You know what I mean? There is even in California an idea of a real America that we're not. And
country butcher in Dallas.
Yeah, and it's super weird because it's actually a minority. That's not, you know, in terms of population and stuff, that's not what the majority of Americans live. But and this is actually part of the theorization of nationalism. Eric Hobsbawm talks about this, that the construction of nationalisms appeals to these authenticating myths that always appeal to these kind of rural ideals that kind of never existed, but that people who don't live in those areas can appeal to and go, look, it never changed there. And if it never changed, then I can appeal to that as an origin. And that's the sort of story that we tell ourselves. And
you're blowing my mind. You're blowing my mind. The liquor store on Paramount and Stewart and Gray is called The Dairy. And
those were actual dairies at one point.
Oh!
Yeah, the drive-in dairies were actually attached to dairies. In fact, in
SoCal.
In SoCal, yeah. The Cerritos Auto Square, they used to all be dairies. That's how my family ended up here. They were dairy farmers. Yeah.
This is actually a great moment for us to maybe like bridge the two. So we grew up, you know, Downey, Artesia, Cerritos, that space, Long Beach.
Yeah.
And we grew up basically as the children of immigrants who came for a better life for their kids. Like literally, that's what it is. Your brother became a high school teacher and counselor. You became a university professor. My brother became editor-in-chief of Gallup. And we know each other through, shout out, Wissam Nassar, Hatem Nassar, Dina Nassar. Like literally, it's a straight line through like people with college educations coming to America so that their children would have more than a college education. Like literally, that's what it is. Mm-hmm. And being Portuguese, you come from, you know, your parents come from an originating culture that did have a colonial imperial experience. You could very easily have become the kind of Anglo Ben Shapiro, right? You could have chosen to adopt the white identity. You could have chosen to go hard on the right. You could have made this work.
Yes.
But you're exactly the opposite, right? What do you think about how we grew up, where we grew up, your personal experience, your parents' experience kind of led to that?
Man, that's a big question. So, I think one thing is my parents. My parents, they had an interesting story even within the Portuguese community. My mom is my whole family is actually, both sides of my family are from the same tiny little rural village in the Azores. And they immigrated around the same time, like with a few years difference. But my mom actually grew up in Montreal. My mom's family went to Canada first, so my mom actually grew up in Montreal, very, very working class part of the city. Like my mom had a very urban upbringing that my brother and I grew up in the suburbs. My dad had a very, very rural upbringing. My mom is the only one of us that like grew up
city girl, yeah,
city, like and poor, like But my grandfather was a janitor at the English Catholic school. So my mom went to the English Catholic school as like the kid of the janitor.
In Canada.
In Montreal, yeah.
Wow,
and
okay.
So, and this was like the rich kid's school, but my mom wasn't rich. And she got this very different outlook where she not only there was a lot of code switching in terms of class and ethnicity, because she was also Portuguese in a neighborhood, growing up in an Italian neighborhood, which was kind of an impoverished neighborhood at the time, but she was also not Italian, so it was kind of all over the place. And she also grew up like speaking a ton of languages. My mom speaks 4 languages fluently. Like she's,
Also, probably as tools of survival.
Yeah, totally. And then my dad was just like, my parents raised us very empathetically, very much in this way that was, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but and this is not to dog on anybody else in our community, because it's all over the map. There are people who were more or less empathetic. There are people who are really empathetic on a personal level, and their politics kind of don't reflect it, whatever. But I feel like a lot of the way that my parents raised us, my brother and I very much were raised to kind of look at the world in a way that encouraged us to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to understand that we don't know everything. I mean, my dad was always really big on let's call it epistemic humility. My dad was really big on like, and it's a very like immigrant dad thing to say, like, well, you think you know better than me? Like, you think you know better than the experts? I'll never forget when I was a teenager and I was gonna buy, and I did end up buying stupidly, some aftermarket parts for my car, and my dad was like, oh, you know better than the engineers? Waste your money, you know better than the engineers?
Bro, you're describing my dad, bro.
And that's like a really immigrant dad thing to say, right? Because there's this sense of like kind of a respect for the people who know more than you. And we grew up with that.
Absolutely, man.
And we grew up with that, but it wasn't only like a bowing down to authority. It was like an understanding that everybody knows something you don't know. You have something to learn from everyone. And then it was like the people, we as you know, the region we grew up in is extremely diverse. And part of it, I think, is just luck. Like, we crossed paths with the right people. I can't even...
You played soccer, right, when you were a kid?
I did. I was really bad. My brother was the athlete. I was not. I was the bookworm. But yeah, I played soccer. But like, I can actually point to people that I've met in my life that like changed my outlook on things. The first dissenting voice I can think of is when I was like 7 years old, and I was in the kid that sat next to me, he wouldn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll never forget this. And I was like, and I asked him, I was like, why don't you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? And he said, oh, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. We don't pray to a flag. And that was it. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a protest. The teacher didn't care. Nobody said anything ever. But I sat next to him, so I was like, "What's going on?" And he said, "We don't pray. We only pray to God. We don't pray to a flag." And I remember being 7 years old and being like, "That actually makes a lot of sense." All right.
Yeah. You're just like, okay, I'll take that.
You know, so it's like if I'm like years later, I'm getting a PhD and I'm writing about nationalism and nationalistic myths, and I'm thinking back about this kid who sat next to me in at Elliott School, but then like I can't even begin. You know, you mentioned Wissam and the Nassar family. I can't even begin to explain how profoundly that friendship has shaped my outlook and enriched me as a person. In fact, Facebook reminded me today that on this day, 10 years ago, Sam and I arrived in Alexandria. I had just gotten over dysentery that I got in Tunisia.
Wow.
We had just landed in Alexandria on this day,
so
10
awesome.
years ago. Isn't that crazy?
Do you remember when Wissam organized the A$AP Brown Imam Jamil Al-Amin concert and Talib Kweli came out and
I do.
So it's that kind of like educated.
Yeah, like a Blackstar reunion that they hadn't had.
He showed up, he totally showed up. Mostaf showed up. Zion, I remember all of them.
Burning Star.
Bernie, yeah, but you're saying like that.
On Underground. No, he's
but that edifies, like where your children are engaging socially edifies your American identity.
Yeah, but and just there was just so much about different communities and different people that I learned just from having, a friend like Wissam. You know him. I'm sure all your viewers don't necessarily, but we're talking about like a uniquely beautiful person here, right?
Yeah.
He's just like a really kind,
Absolutely.
and he has this gift for kind of inserting himself into situations and feeling comfortable. Like he's a master sort of. I don't want to say diplomat because that's going to sound political in a way that I don't think
he's not. Yeah, that he's not.
But let me give you an example. So the reason we were in Alexandria 10 years ago is because we took a basically like worldwide trip 1 year. The year prior, we had gone to New York because he was working on a documentary. We went to Rock the Bells in New York, and then we were driving back. It was actually not the year prior, it was a few years prior. And we were driving back, and we got Dina's car from Fort Greene in Brooklyn and drove it back to Artesia because she didn't need it anymore in New York. So we drove back. We drove cross country, which I recommend. Maybe not now, the climate's different, but driving cross country in the United States is an amazing experience. So we drove cross country, and you have a lot of time in the car with your friend. You're talking, and we were like, what if one day we did this like worldwide? Just go, and it was kind of a joke. And then 3 years later, 2010, I'm finishing up my qualification exams, and Wissam was, I think, finishing up with some job that he had in San Francisco, and he was going to be moving. I'm not sure if he was going to be leaving Oakland or something was changing, but we were both in this kind of in-between space. And we had this conversation. We were like, what if we did that trip? And we bought tickets. This is so impulsive and crazy, and now that I think about it, it's insane that this happened. We bought tickets to Trseda, which is the island that my family's from, and we didn't buy any return tickets. We just went, we'll figure it out. We flew to Trseda. We spent 2 weeks with my family. Sam went to my cousin's wedding, the whole thing.
Wow.
We flew to Portugal, to the north, to Porto, went down to Lisbon, then down to the Algarve region, then took a bus into Spain, were in Spain completely by accident when they won the World Cup, hitchhiked to the ferry, took the ferry to Morocco, bounced around Morocco for a little while, then flew to Tunisia, where I got dysentery and was just extremely sick, and that's a whole different story.
Man.
And then went to Egypt, and we were there for we were in Egypt for a long time, and we were mostly in Mahalla, but yeah, we flew into Egypt, and then like 10 years ago this day, we got into Alexandria from Tunisia. And the reason I bring that up is just to set the stage for an illustration of Wissam's personality and the type of thing that simultaneously I've always admired and has kind of driven me crazy with envy. Is one time we were on a bus. I don't remember if it was a bus or a train, and Wissam, he always has his camera, right? You know, he's an artist, and he's always looking for those little moments of beauty. And he saw somebody, like this lady with her kid or something, and he just starts filming. Like, dude, you can't just film people on a bus, bro. Like, what are you doing?
You're gonna get a shot, dog.
Like, are you crazy? And out of respect for my concern, he kind of asked this lady in this nice way for permission, but you could tell that she was so charmed by him seeing this kind of moment, and he's always been good at that kind of thing. Like he'll put himself, and it's not because he's he's gonna be pissed that we're talking this much about him.
Well, I mean, let me say that one of the reasons he's like that is because of his mom, Allah yarhamha.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Tante Camelia is that person. She's that dynamic personality that can engage anyone. She engages a scholar, she engages the cook, she engages you know what I mean? Like, his mom really had that sense. It's amazing, dog, that you're saying this stuff, because today we live in a world where identity is a really complex thing, and race is a really complex thing, and intersectionality is something that is either adopted or rejected, etc. What are your musings on the Trump moment? What are you thinking as it relates to what happens in the next kind of year and a half?
Man, I don't know. The thing that scares me as a person who kind of looks for certain patterns, and really looks at the kind of the lies we tell ourselves. The thing that worries me is that it might be beyond repair at this point. When you look at the kind of delusions that we have, it really just feels like everything is completely upside down. And I'm not even talking about values being violated. I'm talking about simple, actual misunderstandings of reality. People just looking at something.
Just believability, simple believability.
Simple believability. I mean, certain stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and how we define freedom, or the idea of American exceptionalism. It's always been a debatable topic. Personally, it's not a terribly convincing idea to me. I think every nation is exceptional in its own way. I think every culture is exceptional in its own way. And as a person who has studied the kind of city on a hill mythos that leads into American exceptionalism, I understand the imperialism inherent in it, the bigotry inherent in it. But at the same time, as a son of immigrants who was raised to believe, to understand the opportunities that my family was given, I can't deny all of it, you know what I mean? But when you see how it manifests now, it's almost like we declare our strength as an admission of our weakness. When you look at our response to coronavirus right now, and the way that we go, like Americans will say, this is the best country in the world. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean a damn thing. There's no metric for that. But it's so, like, if you can't even start a conversation, and you know this because you've done the punditry, you've been on shows, you want to have a substantive conversation, you have to start with America is the greatest country in the world, but... Yeah. Right? If you can't even admit that, then nobody listens to you. But what does it mean when you say America's the greatest country in the world right now when we're not doing anything to fix anything? It is the reverse of what we think it is. We think America's the greatest. We think when we're saying America's the greatest country in the world, we're saying this is
different. It's an exception.
It's an exception, and it's so great that it exceeds all else. But when you put it in the context of the present, all you're doing is foreclosing on the possibility of change. America is the greatest country in the world means it's finished. We have nothing to improve.
Yes.
We're not going to work on housing. We're not going to work on medicine. It's the best. We're as free as we'll ever be. We're as good as we'll ever be.
But American exceptionalism ideally would be a recognition of America's unfinishedness, would be a recognition of America's always becoming, would be a...
Exactly. That's one would think that would be how that and this is getting back to the idea of, like, are we serving the nation or is the nation serving us? Like, that what you just described is how that concept might actually be beneficial, but it's not how we're using it right now.
Well, and America is really in many ways like the parallels. It's almost become like a religion. Like, exactly. I say, no, America's not that. And then they're like, no, you're a kafir. You're an America kafir. You're an America infidel. You're not good enough to be an America. And you're like, no, wait. I'm talking about like what the words actually say. I'm not talking about the mythology of the Constitution, the Quran, the God. Yeah.
And that's the thing. What the words actually say doesn't mean as much as the conversation itself kind of being the symbol that gets kind of thrown in your face. Because, I mean, it's really bizarre to be told that you don't love America by people whose whole movement, their slogan was to make America great again because it was presumably no longer great. But pointing out that hypocrisy doesn't matter. They're not trying to be ideologically consistent. They're trying to dominate. You know, and so this is where I really worry about the sort of correctability of that, because when you start to look at like the kind of the patterns taking place, you know, you can pull up any definition, and this always sounds hyperbolic, and I'm not trying to be alarmist or anything, but you can pull up any definition of fascism, and it's always a list of things, and we're marking off a lot of those items, you know? There are a few that we're not, but there's this really deeply ingrained misunderstanding, I think, of who we are and what the concepts that we value mean. Just as an example, rebellion, right? We valorize rebellion in this country in a way that is really interesting because, like right now, my neighbor has a Gadsden flag hanging in his garage.
What is that?
The don't tread on me, the
Okay.
yellow flag with the snake. And the interesting thing about the Gadsden flag is like, it's this flag that has this really rebellious, slogan on it, and it's kind of cool. It has a snake. It's like, don't mess with me, you know. But it's right now at the present time, it's always paired with like the thin blue line, you know. And so simultaneously a celebration of rebellion and a celebration of authority, and that's just this encapsulation of how we think of rebellion in this country. We talk about the Declaration of Independence, we talk about the revolution, we talk about all this stuff, but it's only ever to bolster the status quo, you know. And I don't mean only, I mean, there are plenty of people not doing this, but like in general, the people who kind of run the narrative, the people who have the most power, the people who have the most say, and even those of us who want to dissent and have to kind of give a little bit rhetorically to that side, there's always this way of using the idea of rebellion as something that Americans value. We are rebellious people because we rebel against the government. Okay, what do you mean when you say we rebel against the government? I rebel against big government. Okay, what does that mean? I rebel against social programs.
Mm.
I want CEOs to have money. And by that point, you're not rebelling against a damn thing. You are very much maintaining.
You're reinforcing, you're propping up the injustices.
You know, and so the idea of rebellion, of freedom, of all these things, we use them in these really backwards ways. And it's interesting because this is not only in politics. We do this a lot with like aesthetics and culture. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. It's okay.
No, bro. Just keep going, bro. This is gold.
Like the idea of what is cool is a really interesting concept in American culture. If I were to ask you 3 separate but related questions, I think I could predict your answers, and correct me if I'm wrong here. If I were to ask you, is Bob Marley dope?
Yeah.
Is Bob Marley rebellious?
Yeah.
And is Bob Marley dope because he's rebellious? Mm. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you would answer yes to all 3, yeah?
Mm. Yes, right? To some extent,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. And you might say the same about Rage Against the Machine. You might say the same thing about Wu-Tang Clan. And I would agree with you. I would agree with you 100%. But, and this is where there's a difference between the tropes within the content and the trope and the content itself as a trope. Okay? If we're looking at like Bob Marley as dope because he's rebellious, then we have a little bit of a disconnect because you grew up in the same region I did. You know, every racist here loves Bob Marley. Probably listens to Bob Marley more than you do because they don't listen to anything else. And Paul Ryan's favorite band is Rage Against the Machine. So are these people just hypocrites? Are they just stupid? Or is there something else going on with what we are doing when we talk about or listen to those artists? And this is what I'm basically saying is like, even if the content of Bob Marley's music or the Wu-Tang Clan's music or Rage Against the Machine's music is definitely rebellious and defiant, being a fan of their music is not necessarily rebellious or defiant. Think of being like a high school kid in the 90s. If you are a 17-year-old boy in 1998, and you listen to Wu-Tang Clan, Bob Marley, and Rage Against the Machine, that's pretty low stakes. If you're that same kid and you're rocking a Britney Spears t-shirt at Gar High School, or that dude is brave.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. He's gangster.
And so what's interesting is that we have this whole. I talk about this with my students a lot. Like one of the most vilified aesthetic categories is looking at the stuff. It's always easy to make fun of stuff that's marketed to teenage girls. Anything that teenage girls like is considered culturally inferior. And this is changing, by the way, because young people, honestly, they're better than we are.
I agree with that.
It's changing because of the way that music is marketed and the way that music is consumed. But it is really interesting when you think of like what's cool, what's good, what deserves to be anthologized, what gets nostalgic remakes and spin-offs and TV shows and biopics. It's usually either the stuff that is popular for young men or the stuff that young men eventually came around to after a couple of decades, right? So if you're looking at like, the ways that people usually talk about culture that's marketed to young girls, it's often like looked at as stupid or silly or whatever, but nobody ever pulls out the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven and actually goes, what the hell is this saying? These are bad lyrics. The lyrics to Stairway to Heaven are bad. I'm sorry. Silly. But nobody does that with Led Zeppelin. You know what I mean? Not nobody. People do.
Bro, that is fascinating, bro. I saw an interview that you did for the university where they were talking about like the hot chili pepper on Rate My Professor, and then they went and interviewed like the best looking woman at Long Beach City College, and then they interviewed you, and you're like, yeah, this is probably a tool of harassment for the women. But it's kind of the same idea. Like we're saying that women are equal. We're saying that women are to be ranked like men. And then we create this category that negates like the entire thing that we're doing. I often think of it the other way too. It's not just that like all, Rand Paul or Paul Ryan love Rage Against the Machine. Either they're not listening to the lyrics or they're changing the definition of the lyrics to meet what they, you have like, sometimes you're just like, wait, how? Like there's no way, right?
Exactly.
But there is this there is this sense that how we come to define masculinity is closely entangled with how we come to define Americanness.
Absolutely.
Like, what's more American, dog? A football player that's a lineman, or a badminton champion in the NCAA?
Exactly, and actually, thank you for bringing that up, because that's the bridge between the two things. Like, I in my mind, these things are all just bouncing off.
No, but keep going.
Connection, but yeah, I exactly, and what is really interesting to me is how even in the articulation of that, all you have to do is take a very simple look at it, and you'll see how it falls apart, how it's just not a real thing. I mean, these dudes in these militias in the Midwest, and they're not even like wearing the correct armor. Like I have a bunch of friends.
It's literally like some Halloween costume shit.
Yeah, it's silly as hell. And if they were like furries or something, that would be laughed at. But no, this is enshrined in the Second Amendment. It's like, what? These guys are cosplaying. These guys are nerds. Like, why?
It's a Comic-Con in front of the courthouse.
Right. So why do we make fun of the Comic-Con dudes and not these idiots? Why are we acting like these idiots are standing up for something? They're not. They're standing up for, and this is ultimately what all this COVID stuff is about. They're standing up for their right to just be spoiled brats, man. It's this, and again, it's upside down. We talk about spoiled brats in this country. We're always talking about young people. The young people are not spoiled brats right now. I mean, you live in Huntington Beach, man. I don't need to tell you.
But my students, I always see that my students are so damn resilient. It's mind blowing. They're not the spoiled brats. And
I'm sure there are spoiled brats among them, but it's not like,
of course,
it's not really this widespread thing. It's the people who are really whining right now are affluent, middle class.
People have no reason to complain.
Yeah, people are, and it's over like what, the right to not wear a mask. Like, man, put it on. We would all be out there. Like, Slovenia is able to have birthday parties.
It's what you said. Like if you insist on the exceptionalism, one day that exceptionalism is going to come to define you as not having accomplished what everyone else has accomplished, not being able to manage what everyone has been able to manage, not being able to have basic relationships in the international community, etc. There's a book, I want to say it's called American Exceptionalism, American Exceptionalism. No, it's called Fantasyland.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book describes America as Fantasyland, and he's basically arguing like what you see Donald Trump doing. This is actually core America. This is what America has always been. People that are selling some fucking air that they're saying is going to cure you. People that are like, come lick this snake in the back of your neck, and God is going to love you more. And if you dance, okay. And there's this sense that in the book, there's a sentence that I feel like is of biblical like relevance, Quranic, so that no one's observing to me. He says, in Fantasyland, everyone is graded on a curve.
Yeah.
The idea please.
No, go ahead.
No, please.
And that is the like ultimate lie in it, right?
Yes.
Is that nobody is as free as us. Nobody works as hard as us. Nobody is as tough as us. And then a crisis happens, and suddenly we can't even put in the most minimal effort to make things better. Do you remember that first 2 weeks of the quarantine where there was this utopian sense that oh my God, we suddenly realized that we can work from home if we're disabled. We suddenly realized that we can Like, pollution will actually dissipate.
We can erect Wi-Fi for everyone in the inner city through buses.
All of it. All of this is possible. I mean, we're all going to make banana bread on our life, and everybody's going to have sourdough starters and vegetable gardens, and they're going to learn, they're going to pick up their instruments that they haven't played since high school, and they're going to work 4 hours every day and still be as productive as in an office 8 hours a day. Yeah. And oh my God, we cracked the code for 2 weeks. And then
that's it.
Just like, no, man, I don't want to wear a mask. Fuck that.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Like the most minimal effort.
Yeah.
And it just blows my mind because, like, since 2016, I've had this kind of ongoing debate in my own head about whether I'm going to say the Trump administration for shorthand, but it's not just the Trump administration, because if Biden wins, Tom Cotton's going to run in another 4 years. This is going to stick around, and that's what worries me. But for shorthand, let's say the Trump administration. And I had this constant ongoing dialogue where I'm like, are they stupid, or are they savvy and terrifying? And some of them are definitely savvy and terrifying. DeVos is DeVos is doing her job. She's doing what she was put there to do, you know. But then I look at, like, what they're doing now, and it's like, man, you could have turned this around. Trump could be leading in the polls because his people will support whatever he does.
That's what I don't get.
They could.
I don't get. You know, today he came out. He's like, the Democrats don't want to give the people money. We're going to give everybody. We're going to give, like, now he's like this, like.
And he's running to the left of Joe Biden on,
can you imagine?
Pharmaceutical prices and stuff. But that's also that he'll get the votes, he'll get the polls, and this is, again, that if you're running down the fascism checklist, man, this is the extreme right. Flirting with socialist rhetoric with no intention of delivering. Like, this is the proof that the political spectrum is a circle that's cyclical, not a line that has two ends, right? Well, where does you know, are you going to recognize the legitimacy of elections? We'll see fall into that. Is that on the checklist? It's got to be on the checklist. I'm sure it is.
We'll see. I don't know. I'll see if I like the election results.
There's so many different checklists. I mean, but the one that kind of blew my mind recently that I think the definition that everybody goes off of right now is the Robert Paxton one.
Yeah.
I'm trying to pull this up right now. But the one that always blew my mind that I was reminded of recently was Umberto Eco. Let me see. Well, there's the obsession with a plot, of course, but and then the, like, oh man, I can't find it right now. But basically, Eco talks about how it becomes. Post it in the comments of the video when it comes out. All right. When you find it. I find it. But he talks about how it becomes a death cult, basically. It's everybody is educated to become a hero, which leads to the embrace of a cult of death. Everybody is educated to become a hero. That scares the hell out of me. Because we have this heroic understanding of everything in this country. Everything has to be dramatic. This is one of the reasons it's really hard to talk about the beginnings of authoritarianism in this country. Because everybody's expecting this, like, black horse to come running in, and we're like, oh shit, now it's a dictatorship. That's not how it works. That's one thing that Egypt taught me. Dictatorship is boring. It's just, most people are comfortable most of the time, or, like, not comfortable, but, like, they're living their lives. A lot of people support it, you know, and it's mostly just boring. And there's this cult of personality, and people are afraid to do certain things, but if they don't do those things, then there's nothing to worry about. And that's exactly right. That's exactly. If you don't cause 5 civil disturbances, you're not going to be thrown into a van that's unmarked by soldiers with no badges. Yeah, exactly. But we think everything is going to unfold like it does in the movies. It's all going to be Saving Private Ryan or Schindler's List or you know, it's just this constant onslaught of horrors, and it's not. You know, and we all think that if those horrors actually prevented themselves, then we would be the hero. You know, you would be the abolitionist in 1861. You would kill baby Hitler. And it's like, no, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You'd keep your mouth shut. like everybody else. Lots of good people kept their mouths shut.
You wouldn't even buy a cup of coffee at the wrong joint, homie. That's how much you want to defend yourself. You know what I mean? Like, let alone kill baby Hitler. Yeah. It's funny you say Umberto Eco. I'm always fascinated by the idea of like America being like a hyper reality. The life that we are living now is more absurd than anything Walt Disney ever came up with.
It's wild.
It's crazier than Tomorrowland, Neverland, Pirates of the Caribbean. Like the President of the United States, he's got woman with the sex demons thing, and he's putting her up. Like this is like, it's mind blowing.
And this is the other kind of pillar of what scares me is social media, and the role that social media plays in people like that having their views not just proliferated, but like argued seriously. Like the amount of time wasted explaining to somebody why it's absurd to think that children are being shipped in Wayfair furniture. Like, what? Like, and
you know what I worry about? Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, the interesting thing is, no, go ahead. Sorry.
I say it, dog. Go ahead.
The interesting thing is that whole conversation is, if I say, this just happened yesterday, if I say the Wayfair thing is silly, and I just like laugh it off, because what else am I supposed to do? Take it seriously, like deconstruct it, ask like, why didn't you and some friends get together $17,000 and buy a bed and see if a baby came in it? Like, there are all these, like, so you just laugh it off, and then someone goes, oh, you don't take this seriously. You don't take human trafficking seriously. It's like, what do you mean I don't take human trafficking seriously? You know what? I live in Long Beach. Oh, now I live in Lakewood, but I live on the border of Long Beach. I still work in Long Beach. The Grand Prix is a locus of human trafficking. Every big tournament, the World Cup, the Olympics, is a locus of
Bro, the guy that told you that was at a strip joint that is a locus of human trafficking around the corner. Come on.
And what do you do? And what do you do when people talk about strip joints? You have a good laugh at the expense of the back room and shit. That back room, that's human trafficking.
Straight up. That's real.
Every
modern day sex slavery.
Yeah, every religious carve out for polytheism, or you've talked about this at length, is not necessarily being used for that, but gets used for it, you know?
Absolutely.
But no, you're focused on Wayfair.
You get into this hyper real world where there's no center, and you can't. You know, one of the most prominent Muslim scholars at an American Muslim university said in response to a critique of that woman, the demon sex doctor, he's in public on Facebook, he wrote, if she's wrong about that, does that mean that she's wrong about all of her knowledge? I'm just like, wait, how are you, like, dog, like, you're playing, like, you're supposed to be representing God, telling people how to interpret the word of God, and you're like, yo, you don't need to be over critiquing the sex with demons lady.
That's such a weird...
How?
Have you never been wrong? I know I've been wrong many times. Does that mean I'm wrong about everything?
Yeah, exactly. It's this weird, like,
constantly wrong. Yeah. But that doesn't mean I'm always wrong.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the things that I know that I'm wrong, you know, like and some of us have learned to not overstep, or like, I'm not going to sit here and try to talk about epistemology. I don't know epistemology. That's why I listen to the epistemologists. If not epidemiology. I also,
you do know about epistemology.
Yeah,
epidemiology.
But, I'm not an epidemiologist, so that's why, you know, but this idea, I don't know, man. That's it's so disheartening. And it's like you see this then start to make its way, as a teacher, you see it start to make its way into student papers, right? And at a certain level, they've always been doing that. Like, they make sloppy arguments. They don't understand how scientific inquiry works. So they say things like, oh, the theory changed, that means it was wrong. It's like, no, that's how it works. And it used to be much easier to be like, all right, well, let me explain to you why this line of argument doesn't work, and help you kind of understand things. And it's more and more like,
yeah,
it's entrenched. I mean, I've been cased by Turning Point USA. Like, they come to campus, they have an event, and then like a couple of days later, I'm having a lesson, and some kid is that wasn't there before is saying weird stuff and asking crazy questions that are really antagonistic. Like, it's there, you know, and I'm pretty used to that kind of strain of argumentation. Like, they don't scare me. I'm intellectually pugnacious, let's say. But
the space is completely fucked. The space, it tears the sanctity of the educational experience.
And you start to see really weird trends. Like, I'm a few years back, I got a lot of like just pretty explicitly white supremacist papers, and they were all from young Latino men. You know?
Yeah, bro. I don't understand that, bro. I don't understand that.
I do, because I'm a white dude with a Spanish last name. You know, if my family came from Portugal to California and we retain our European identity, then a descendant of Spaniards who came to Mexico can retain his European identity. And all you have to do to tap into that, if you're a white supremacist, is do what they did before with Italian people and Irish people, all of whom were marginalized people. But the price of assimilation is always to step on somebody who's underneath you. You know, the price of assimilation is always, I mean, in America, it's basically anti-blackness.
The price of assimilation in America is anti-blackness.
Absolutely. If you look at, and this is not a new idea. I mean, Thomas Nast had cartoons about, and they were themselves bigoted cartoons because he was really anti-Irish. But part of what he was talking about is the way that Irish people assimilated into cities in the Northeast by essentially becoming cops who beat up on freed black men. Like, wow. and that's not, it doesn't even have to be that dramatic. Just think about how immigrant communities like ours eventually kind of work their way into the American dream. You buy property, which means
into Orange County. Yeah, huh? Yeah.
You know,
I grew up in Downey. I'm now sitting in Huntington Beach.
Yeah, you know, it's not. You don't have to be a terrible person to do this. This is how America works. You know, it is assimilation. That's
is it uniquely American, Brian? No, because like. No, right? Because in Mexico, for example, there's only been one indigenous president the whole time, right? Like there's
no, it's definitely not uniquely American. I mean, it's not, and I don't want to.
But America's ugliness is uniquely American,
right? And I'm talking about America. I know America.
Right. No, I totally feel you. Yeah.
I don't think it's uniquely American, and in fact, there's a lot of writing about how this is just an extension of Europe, and you know, but. I mean,
you remember that kid Anders Breivik in Norway? He cited Richard Spencer 57 times in his manifesto.
American thinkers always make their way into. I mean, Hitler looked at the eradication of native people. I mean, it's American ideals. America's just so everything we do is on a kind of grand scale, right? It's just. Culturally big, politically big, you know, and a lot of that is good, right? When you look at kind of the implications of the American Revolution worldwide and what it inspired and all of that, you know, that's good. That I mean, it's not like unequivocally 100% good.
Pure, pristine. No,
nothing is. But
it pushed the world forward.
It pushed the world forward, and even if it was disingenuous, even in the introduction of that kind of rhetoric into political discourse worldwide was important, you know. And this is one of the things that I teach the Declaration of Independence in my composition classes every semester, and one of the things that I try to show my students is like, you think you've read this text, but you haven't. You didn't pay attention to what's actually happening in this text, and the argument that it makes. Not because it's not a simple like we're going to break now. It's not.
It requires exegesis, literally, like your interpretation.
Yeah, and one of the things they come away with is like, oh, this is way more interesting and more like intellectually stimulating than I thought. you know, because all they get is the like 4th of July comic book version, and that's fine for celebrating 4th of July. But if you really want to understand
what this thing is
what
about,
inspired the revolution, what are we celebrating? Should we be celebrating it? Was it perfect? Then it requires some looking, because it's not as simple as at the same time that it's not unequivocally good. It's also not as simple as saying, well, they owned slaves, so we throw the baby out with the bathwater. No, like, it was complicated, and it wasn't complicated enough. Jefferson knew what he was doing was wrong. Washington chased down slaves until he died. Like, they did these terrible things, and they remain terrible things. But the framework for dismantling it was also there, and this is why, to me, like, revisiting those texts and talking about what's actually in them is so important. I did the same thing with the letter from Birmingham jail. People just use Martin Luther King Jr. as this shorthand for like peaceful protest, which they
for docility, for being docile.
You know, and when I go through it line by line with my students, they're like, "Whoa, this is
a bit more of what they think it's Malcolm than."
Yeah, exactly. You know, and then you go and you read Malcolm, and you see that Malcolm was not just like trying to start a war. You know, it's and then so you know, it's this. Those are the moments where I actually really appreciate my job. You know, because other times it can be really disheartening, but.
It's an honor to be able to walk Americans through the originating documents of the founding. I have also found that that's one of the best. I mean, I literally only went to law school. Mm-hmm. Like, I never in my life wanted to work as a lawyer. I only went to law school to learn about America, to learn about American history, and then, you know, I ended up in Lexington, Virginia, Washington, and 9/11 happened 3 weeks later, and I was like, yeah, let's ponder America.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, like, I could do this for 5 hours with you. You're one of those people that I feel have always felt is a kindred spirit. You're the best of what this society has to offer, I think, because of what your parents did and because of who you are and who your brother are, but also because you're comfortable in the complexity of what we are and what we can become. You know what I mean? And so much of what America needs, I think, right now, what we all need is to just be able to, like, be centered in contradictory streams of ideas, of identity, of interest, and try to, like, walk to a better light. I always think about, you know, what you said about Bob Marley. You know, a lot of people will associate me with, you know, Bob Marley or a Rastafarian influence in life. You know, I'm a feminist. Bob Marley was not a feminist.
Right.
Being Rastafarian is like, you know how many reggae songs I can give you that are about, like, my woman doesn't wear makeup?
Right.
Because she's a real woman. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, but I'm able to hold the complexity of all of that, right? Because there's so much prophetic beauty that can be derived from that way of being. I love you, bro. I really appreciate you doing this. I know that this is not the most ideal time in life to have a really long conversation with me, but you've blessed us with your wisdom, man.
Yeah. Hey, and if you we didn't get to talk too much about our teacher or any of that stuff. If you want to talk again, I'd be happy to.
I would love to, man. I would love to. This has been an absolute blessing, bro.
All right, man.
All right, Brian. Thank you, dog. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Take it easy.
Much love.
حضرات السادة الركاب، أهنئكم بسلامة الوصول إلى مطار القاهرة الدولي